Digital Archives Manager at Queens Library here in Queens, New York. Just a little bit about myself. Our department here, we have 3 full-time staff and 1 part-time digital archivist. Our digital repository has about 27,000 items right now, and we deal with photographs, maps, newspapers, local history books, art books, manuscript collections, musical scores, and we also have a fairly extensive oral history interview collection. So our materials come from here at the library, our archives. We have some external partners. We worked with Queens Museum and the Museum of City of New York, as well as a local cemetery to digitize some of their materials. And we also have, through our Queens Memory Program, we get materials from members of the community where we do story sharing events, do interviews, and scanning days. So we get a lot of different types of materials coming in, and so we have a wide variety of metadata we have to create kind of as an ongoing basis. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Let me get to my slides. There we go. Metadata matters, the basics. So we'll start off with what is metadata. I'm going to talk about this in very beginner terms, just starting off. I'll explain some definitions. There's some things that I'll briefly mention and not go into a lot of detail on, but I will give recommendations for where you can find some other information as well. So what is metadata? The short answer you usually get is it's data about data, which is brief and descriptive. A little more in-depth description is the Society of American Archivists, from their glossary of archival and records terminology, says it's a characterization or description documenting the identification, management, nature, use, or location of information resources. Metadata is frequently used to locate or manage information resources by abstracting or classifying those resources or by capturing information not inherent in the resource. So it's internal and external information to the resource. Typically, it's organized into distinct categories and relies on conventions to establish the values for each category. Priscilla Kaplan in Metadata Fundamentals for All Librarians, which is the first book I had in library school on metadata, and I still have it and still use it, says structured information about an information resource of any media type or format. Excuse me. So it's basically the who, what, when, where, why, and how that helps to discover, identify, interpret, and interact with content. Now, for types of metadata, there are 3 main types of metadata we deal with in libraries, museums, and archives. It's descriptive metadata, which is sort of information about the content, structural metadata, and administrative metadata. And I'll go into those one by one in a little more detail. Descriptive metadata, again, information about content. It helps with discovery, which is how can someone find the resource. Identification, how can that resource be distinguished from other resources. And selection, so does that resource fit a particular need? And if not, what will? It describes an object, giving basic facts, who created it, and what is it about. Administrative metadata is data that helps to manage and use an information source. How can this resource be distinguished from other ones? It's broken down into technical metadata, preservation metadata and rights metadata. Technical metadata is such as what kind of software do we need to use. Preservation metadata, what steps such as reformatting or digitization were taken to preserve the resource. Rights metadata, are there any copyright restrictions, access restrictions, and who manages that access? Structural metadata describes the structure of an object, including its components and their relation to each other. It's intended to describe the internal organization of the object and the components, how they fit together. It's primarily computer reading, read by computers. It helps with websites and e-readers. On a computer, when you have a newspaper, it helps format where the different articles are on the layout and the ability to go to the next page to find the rest of an article. and it also helps with turning pages in your e-reader. That's all structural metadata that lets it flip through to the next page. So it helps facilitate navigation of complex objects. Today I'm going to mostly focus on descriptive metadata. That is the type of metadata you'll be doing whether you're dealing with digital objects or physical objects. There are differences, but it's all descriptive metadata regardless. So within that, on descriptive metadata, there are different types of metadata standards. There's metadata structure standards, which are also called metadata element sets or schemas. There are data content standards, also called data value standards. I'm sorry. There are data content standards, and then there are data value standards, also called controlled vocabularies. Then the final one, which I won't go into very much today because it's a little more complex than I can get into in an hour, are data exchange standards. I'll talk a little bit about it, but not as much as the others. So metadata structure standards or schema. Those are the categories of data that make up a record. Excuse me. Some examples of that are Dublin Core metadata element sets, machine readable cataloging, which is MARC, which you may be familiar with, VRA Core, which is a data standard for the description of works of visual culture, as well as the images that document them. That was designed to create a hierarchy of collection, work, and image level records. For example, with VRA Core, you can catalog an actual collection of statue works, an individual statue, and photos from different angles of that one statue. You can do that all in one larger record, so it's good for that sort of hierarchical relationships. And then encoded archival description, which is an XML standard for encoding archival finding aids. Those are the most common metadata structures that we in the library, museum, and archives world probably deal with. So I'll talk a little bit about the data content standards, which is, let me move to my next slide, sorry. Too early. Okay, sorry, data content standards, which are the set of formal guidelines for inputting data into metadata elements. It's what information should be recorded and how should they be recorded. So you can see, okay, I have to apologize. I have a slide in the wrong order here. I'm getting nervous. Okay. Metadata element standards, where I talked about, it's Dublin Core, MARC, VRA Core, and EAD. I'm going to backtrack a little and give an example of each of those. The Dublin Core elements you can see here. You have the element name, then the description. Dublin Core is good because it's easy to use for people. We can just look at the tag on the element side and know what it describes. It's not as complex as some of the other ones where it's good for computers but not so great for people. Dublin Core is good because it's very simple, so it's easy if later on you need to use a different schema. It's easier to map from Dublin Core to something else. MARC, this is an example of MARC. If you've used it for books in your library catalog, you may be familiar with it. It's a standard for representing bibliographic and related information in machine-readable form. If you're already, as I said, if you're already using this for other things, this is a good option. VRA Core, this is where I was talking about you can have the work, the collection, and the image level. Again, these are fairly easy to understand tags. The agent is the individual group or corporate body that has contributed to the item. It's structured in XML as well, so it can be a little more complex to do if you haven't done it before. But as I said, it's good for doing large collections and then drilling down into the individual item. Okay, then EAD, I'll talk a little more about this later, but briefly, you can see it's a little more complicated to understand the tags, but it's once you get used to it, you know, like unit title is title, biog-hist is the biography or historical note, scope content. It's a little more confusing than the others, but once you've learned it, it's not that complicated. Okay, so now I will move on to data content standards, which are the guidelines for inputting data into metadata elements. It's what information should be recorded and how should it be recorded. This specifies the content, order, and syntax of the data. Some examples you may be familiar with are RDA resource description and access, CCO, cataloging cultural objects, or DAX. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot. They have a lot of different rules. One thing I will say is it's easier to follow an established standard for this than to try to create your own, but you do whatever works within your organization. Those controlled vocabularies. So this is one of the most important parts, I think. It's also called, as I said, data value standards. It's a list of standardized terms used to create metadata. We use them to identify the terms, names, values we use to populate the metadata element sets. Some examples you may be familiar with are the art and architecture thesaurus, faceted application of subject terminology, which is adapted from Library of Congress subject headings. They're called FAST headings. Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names, Library of Congress. These are all really good resources to use, and I've included links to them later on so you can take a look at some examples of that. Now, the data exchange standards, again, they're specifications for encoding data. It's the encoding packaging for data so it can be machine readable and be processed by different systems. This type of standard is often a manifestation of a particular data structure standard that's just been encoded or marked up. So MARC XML, EAD, RDF, it's a little too complex for us to go into too much today, but I did want to mention it. So when it comes to starting with metadata, starting with cataloging, there's this idea of granularity, which is how in-depth in the cataloging are we going to get? There's collection level metadata, which provides an overall description, including context of a group of objects. That includes finding aids. You could create an inventory in a finding aid, but you don't usually get as specific as item level. It's usually better for broader, here's sort of an idea of everything we have. EAD records, again, they're very similar, basically the same thing as finding aids, but on a computer. And then there's a catalog record you could do, which makes it findable in the library catalog, but it usually has minimum data. I'll show an example here. This is a sample of our finding aid. Again, it'll be in the slides. You can take a look through, but you can see just that it's not as item level as some of the other examples I'll show later. So this case, it's the Ludlam family papers. It's got the date. This one is only one folder, half a cubic foot. It's a handful of items. They can be much longer. We have collections that are thousands of items. And then, you see there's a very brief creator sketch, very brief scope and content note, and the inventory is only this one item. We have some where it's pages and pages of inventory, but if it's a smaller collection like this, or you just don't have the resources to do item level cataloging, a finding aid is a perfect way to deal with it. And here's an example of that same finding aid encoded. You can see all those tags I showed before. It's all the same material. It's got the same title. The description is still in there. The scope and content note is still in there. You can see right over in here. And the inventory is just this little area down here. Now, one thing we haven't managed to do yet, but that we are hoping to do, is be able to create linking so that when somebody clicks on this box and folder number, it'll take them to those materials in the digital archives. And then here's an example, as I said, of that catalog record. This is, again, minimal data. This is a record for one of our archives vertical files. They do newspaper clippings. So it's constantly changing. And since everything is copyrighted, they can't really digitize them and post them online. But this is a good way to let people know that, yes, we've been collecting information on Amazon, potentially at Long Island City, which is now not happening. And again, it's good for if things are copyrighted and you can't publicly display them to at least get the information out there that we have it. So now item level cataloging describes specific items. So here's an example of Dublin Core. You'll see it's very simple. These tags are all very simple to do. This is a full record for one item. It's a good sort of quick and not so dirty way of cataloging. Here's a VRA Core record. This is just a brief part of it. It's a much more code-intensive record. You can see it's got, like, for date set, there's 3 different values we fill in. This is helpful for, since it has earliest date and latest date, if we don't know when something is, we can put in a time frame. For example, if this was from sometime between 1920 and 1930, we could put both of those dates, and that would make it searchable for that general time period rather than having to know the exact date. Okay. Now I'm going to move on a bit to best practices. This is going to be for going over item and collection level cataloging metadata creation. There's 4 main aspects of this, which are file naming conventions, basic minimum metadata, controlled vocabularies, and capturing metadata. File naming conventions, there's 2 ways you can go about it. You can use established classification systems, which, Dewey Decimal System, Library of Congress, SUDOC, which is the government documents system. They're easy in that they can be loaded into your online catalog. If you already have an online catalog and it uses Dewey, you can do them the same way. You can't really do item level cataloging for any kind of really archival materials because it's hard to indicate one specific item with a Dewey number. So I wouldn't recommend it for item level, but it's good for collection level cataloging. Other than that, you can create your own. In many cases, that'll be ideal because it can be suited to your specific needs, but you do need to plan ahead. If you're creating your own file naming convention, it needs to be unique so that it can help identify digital files. You can't have 2 files with the same name. We frequently get items from people donating them at our Queens Memory events where it was a photo taken on their phone and it's an interesting photo of an interesting event in Queens, but they're all named, P23, P24, and then when someone else donates something from their same type of cell phone, they have the same file numbers. So we've had to come up with file naming conventions that we change those file names so that they all are individually unique. It also helps locate physical resources and that you can have the file name somehow indicate where the physical object will be. It also helps with, in our system, our batch loading to our digital archives, the file name, that unique identifier, is the system locates it in the metadata and pairs it with the digital file of that name, and that's how it batch loads all of our materials. Again, it needs to be easily identifiable so that somebody looking at it might be able to figure out what it is rather than just a random series of numbers. This is especially true for digital materials where you may have just a folder on a drive full of things and you're trying to figure out what's what. It shouldn't be too long because some computer systems have trouble with super long file names, and it needs to be computer readable. So question marks and ampersands don't work. Spaces can cause errors. I would stick to underscore or dash. And if you're including dates, you should use a standard formatting such as month, month, day, day, year, 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 or some version of that. Again, it helps to work with whatever existing naming conventions your institution is using, if they're using any. You don't want to have to spend all your time renaming files. We had a problem with some of our materials that we digitized. The file names had periods in the middle of various parts of the file name, and our systems can't read that, so we had to go through literally thousands of photographs and rename all of the files. It was really bad. So don't do that. I'm going to show next a couple samples of the naming conventions we use and walk you through them just so you can kind of see how it's not always going to be exactly the same, but it works within the type of material and the system we're using. I won't go through all of this, but I'll point out a few things. So you can see for books and scores, we were already cataloging the physical books and scores in our library catalog using MARC records. So we've adapted those to our digital archives. So the file name is that same catalog database number and then a page number. For maps, our archives was already cataloging them based on whether they were small, medium, or large drawers, and then the cabinet number, the drawer number, the folder number, and then the map number, the item number in that folder, and then a 0 for the front of the image and the 1 for the back image. It looks kind of complicated, but when you're doing all of your maps that way, it makes it really easy to say, oh, okay, I know exactly where that map is that this person wants to look at. Our photograph collections, we have a collection code that we use. This one here, LDP, is for the Long Island Daily Press. And then obviously we have over 3,000 items, so it's just we start with 000001 and work our way up. And you can look through the rest of these. It's not, I'm not going to talk you through all of it because I'm not sure you don't all want to hear all of that. But yeah, so file naming conventions are important because you don't want to have to go back and do a bunch of work all over again. So the minimum basic metadata. Full robust metadata is ideal, but we don't always have the time or staffing levels to allow for that. You want to take some time to think about what data you want to capture. I would say the bare minimum of what sort of data you would record would be, again, that identifier. It's required for digital items because everything has to have a file name, and it is the only way to pair a digital file with the metadata. Title, creator, date, description could include the format, the location, and the subjects, or you could separate those out into their own fields if you felt like it. And that would work for your organization. Then type, you want to know what type of material is. And right statement is particularly important if you're publishing something online. If it's somebody's photograph collection, you want to make sure you're telling people that you have the right to do that. Let's see. Controlled vocabularies. Again, these are very important because these are those lists of standards terms that we use to standardize our metadata. Not everything needs to be authority controlled. Obviously, your descriptions aren't going to be, but it is particularly useful for names, geographic locations, material types, and subject headings. We use Library of Congress name authorities for our name convention. It's easier to try to find everything by that same person if you're using an authority. In our collections, this same person, Edgar Rutter, E.E. Rutter EE with the dates, it was in there these 4 different ways. This last one with the asterisk is the actual Library of Congress authority term for Edgar Rutter. So we had to go through and make sure everything was standardized so that if you're looking for stuff by Edgar Rutter, you would find all of them together at the same time. They're especially, these controlled vocabularies are especially important if you're planning to share your records, either with OCLC or harvesting through a group like DPLA, because they want everybody to use standardized terms. And here are the links for those thesauri and term lists that I told you about earlier. You'll get a copy of this, so you'll have those for your reference. So now that you have an idea of what kind of metadata you need to capture, let's talk about how you can start creating metadata records. So capturing metadata. You want to capture as much as you can the first time around. Once you have your list of minimum basic metadata, you can think about what data you may want to capture, even if you might not want to use it right now. For example, we include georeference location codes on all of our materials because we know that eventually we want to be able to map these assets and show exactly where they were, and we don't want to have to go back and try to find that information for everything. The different ways you can do this are with spreadsheets, databases, catalogs, and integrated library systems, collection management software. They all have their pros and cons. We use a combination of these, so I'll go into that a bit. Spreadsheets like Microsoft Excel are good because they're inexpensive, and it's probably the easiest way to capture metadata. They can be reused for other systems and other schemas. For example, we catalog in VRA Core for our photographs, but we participate with Urban Archive, and we submit some of our materials to them, and for that we need the Dublin Core fields. So we created a crosswalk to map the fields, and since everything was in spreadsheets, it's very easy to do that. It's also good if fields often repeat. If it's going to be the same name, you can just copy it all the way down instead of having to enter it one at a time. It's easy to standardize and template these spreadsheets into schemas. We use OpenRefine with ours. We take the spreadsheets, upload it to OpenRefine, and template it out into VRA Core or Dublin Core as necessary. The downside to, obviously, spreadsheets is that the resources and metadata, it's just a file. It's not, there's no public access, there's no way to view anything, it's just metadata. This is an example of one of our spreadsheets. You can see we have these categories at the top. We fill those in for everything, and there's actually a few more, but this is just I wanted to include a brief one. This is an example of one of the digital assets management systems. You can see how you enter things one at a time. So whereas with the spreadsheet, you can just sort of click and drag it down to copy. If you're doing it right into this, in this example, collective access, which is a very good system, but you do have to enter things each individual time. If you're going to use your library catalog or your ILS, that's useful if your organization is already using one to catalog other things. It does provide at least the information that you own something to the public. Even if it's not digitized, they can find out that you have it. And if you've already got it, then there's no added expense to your institution. These content management softwares like Content DM, Collective Access, Vital, Omeka, Past Perfect, Islandora, they let you load your digitized items along with the metadata. So it does provide, it can provide public access. They usually have a public interface you can use. You do have to enter items one at a time, and it does cost money. So if you don't have resources for that, then it's a non-starter in some cases. The other thing, if you do use a collection management software, is that you want to make sure you can get your resources out if something happens and you end up having to either switch to another one or something happens and you just need that data. You don't want it to be trapped in that management software. Okay, so once you're getting started, you've thought about all of your metadata structured standards, you've chosen a schema, you want to make a list of the required elements that you're going to use. Again, schemas are great. You don't always have to use everything in a schema. You want to adapt it to your own needs, figure out what works for you, and figure out what's practical. As I said, we have 3 full-time staff and 1 part-time. We don't have a huge department. We don't have unlimited funding, so we've sort of adapted what exists to our purposes. Data content standards, you can add local rules if you need to, or you can just make up your own rules. I find it easier to learn an established standard than to invent a new one, personally. Controlled vocabularies, I gave you all those links. They're very easy to use. They're easy to search for, but you could make up your own list of preferred terms if you'd rather. And then the final thing I would add to your preparation to get started is creating a data dictionary or a procedures manual. You want to write everything down. You have all of these ideas, all of these rules you want to follow. It can't just be in your head or just among you and the other person you work with, because someday you will retire or go on vacation, and you'll want to make sure that the next person coming along will know what's happening and will be able to continue the work. And that is it. Do we have any questions? I see some people are typing, but I don't. Are there any questions? Yes, the slides will be sent out probably tomorrow, I think. Okay, so there's a question about Dublin Core having free-form descriptions. We don't use any authority control or anything over the descriptions. We actually kind of like the idea that you can just free text because you can sort of describe things more elaborately. Like we'll have a photo of a house in a neighborhood that's, for example, still in Queens here. The house doesn't exist anymore, but since it's sort of free form, we can say, oh, this house was built in 1805 by Frederick Weber, and then in 1857 it was renovated by this other person. You can sort of give a narrative of it, and then like all those names you mentioned and the places would go in. They would have authority-controlled fields under subjects or creator or a different field. So you can include the same information in different ways. The free-form description is a little helpful because if people are keyword searching and they don't use a authority-controlled term, you can still find the information. Okay, so there's a question here about the spreadsheets with collective access. We don't use collective access anymore. My understanding is that, yes, you can do a spreadsheet and then do a batch import to collective access, but I don't know firsthand how that works. When we were using collective access, we had to enter in each individual item one at a time, but we're using Vital now, and we're able to batch import things. But we still use those spreadsheets. And then as I said, we template it into either Dublin Core or VRA Core, and then that's what we batch load to the system. Oh, you're welcome. There's not a standard for New York place names. We use the Library of Congress, so it's like, for example, Forest Hills and in parentheses, New York, New York. One thing we do, because we're in Queens and we have a lot of different neighborhoods that do not have authority names, so we've kind of created some in-house, like local authorities that we use for those. The main thing I would say is if you pick one, stick to it. Don't be mixing your geographic authority resources, because then things get a little weird. Yes, so what happened for us was we had two systems going at once because Queens Memory was separate from the digital archives, and when we merged them, we had to pull all of the Queens Memory materials out of collective access and then upload it to the new database. So what we did is we exported it as a spreadsheet, cleaned that up, did our templating, and then we were able to batch load it. We did little batches because it was a lot of things, but we did probably a couple hundred at a time. But yes, it was from those spreadsheets. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. The last question was, I forget that everybody can't see them. The last question was, did we migrate metadata to the new CMS from collective access or from spreadsheets? We exported a spreadsheet from collective access and then did some work on that and uploaded that to the new system. Okay, so yes, a comment on the local geography authorities. I don't know if DHPSNY could collate the various local geography files into one resource. I don't work directly for DHPSNY, but I think that would be a great idea. We sort of had to come up with it on our own because something like that didn't really exist. And we'd be glad to share what we do. Yeah, local geography jam. Would that be like a wiki hack? Well, thank you for attending. I hope it was helpful. This is may not be a surprise to you. This was the first webinar I've done, so I apologize for a few false starts. It was nerve-wracking, but it was very gratifying to do, and I appreciate all of your attention and the wonderful comments. So thank you.